A stray dog stops Joe Rogan's car to show him something unthinkable. The night was eerily quiet. The city had long since drifted into slumber, leaving the streets bathed in the cold glow of flickering streetlights. Joe Rogan, exhausted from a long day of meetings and filming, gripped the wheel of his black Tesla as he drove down a desolate highway just outside Los Angeles. The hum of the tires against the asphalt was the only sound breaking the stillness. Then, out of nowhere, a dark shape darted into the road. Joe slammed the brakes, his pulse spiking as the Tesla skidded to a halt. His heart pounded. A dog, a scruffy, mud-streaked mutt, stood frozen in the middle of the road, staring directly at him. For a second, Joe just sat there, gripping the wheel, his breath uneven. The dog's eyes, wide and desperate, locked onto his. There was something unsettling in its gaze. Not fear, not aggression, but urgency. It wasn't just another stray wandering the streets. It was waiting for him. He reached for the door handle, hesitating. Strays were common, but this one had deliberately stopped his car. The dog took a step forward, then another. And then, as if realizing time was running out, it let out a sharp, haunting bark and sprinted off the road, only to stop a few feet away, looking back expectantly. Joe frowned. What the hell? It wanted him to follow. His gut told him to drive away. But something deeper, a primal instinct he couldn't ignore, urged him to step out of the car. As the cold air hit his face, the dog barked again, this time more desperate. Then it turned and ran. Joe took a deep breath, then started after it. Whatever this dog was trying to show him, it wasn't good. Here's the next part of the story. Following the outline for conflict emerges. The problem, 20%. Joe's boots crunched against the dirt as he followed the stray off the road and into the darkness. The dog moved fast, too fast for something malnourished and dirty, but it paused every few feet, looking back, making sure Joe was still behind. Whatever it wanted to show him, it needed him to hurry. Joe glanced back at his Tesla, its headlights cutting through the night like a beacon of safety. A voice in his head told him to turn back. This is insane. You don't follow stray dogs into the dark. But another voice, the one that had pushed him to chase truth his entire life, kept him moving forward. They passed through a gap in a rusted chain-link fence, the metal rattling as Joe brushed against it. Beyond, the air turned thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something off. A coppery metallic tang that made his stomach tighten. The dog let out a low whine. Then it ran ahead and stopped, staring into the darkness. Joe's throat went dry. His eyes adjusted to the dim moonlight, and at first he saw nothing but overgrown grass and scattered trash. But then, something moved. Joe froze. The shape was small, barely visible in the shadows. He pulled out his phone, switching on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dark, landing on a child. A little girl, no older than 6 or 7, lay curled up against a tree, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. Her clothes were torn, her face streaked with dirt and dried tears, and she wasn't moving. Joe's breath hitched. Oh God! The dog whimpered and nosed the child's arm, but she didn't react. Joe rushed forward, his pulse roaring in his ears. He crouched beside her, gently touching her shoulder. Her skin was cold. Too cold, hey, he murmured, shaking her lightly. Hey, kid, can you hear me? For a moment, nothing. Then, a faint, shuddering breath. She was alive. Joe exhaled, in relief, but the feeling was short-lived. Why was she out here alone? His mind raced. Had she been lost? Abandoned? Or worse, had someone put her here on purpose? He scanned the area, suddenly hyper-aware of the silence pressing in around them. They weren't safe here. Scooping the girl. Into his arms, he turned back to the dog. It wagged its tail once, then took off again, barking urgently. Joe swore under his breath. There was more. Holding the child close, he followed the dog deeper into the night, and with every step, dread curled tighter in his gut. Here's the next part, following the outline for rising action. The journey, 30%. Joe's heart pounded as he cradled the little girl in his arms. She was barely conscious, her breathing weak and uneven. He could feel the faint tremors in her tiny body, cold, exhaustion, maybe even fear. The stray dog, his unexpected guide, didn't stop. It sprinted ahead, disappearing into the shadows, only to reappear moments later, barking impatiently. Joe's mind raced. Why was the dog still leading him somewhere? Hadn't he already found the emergency? Then a sickening thought hit him. What if she wasn't the only one? His grip tightened on the girl as he picked up his pace. The path was uneven, littered with broken glass and damp leaves, but the dog knew exactly where it was going. Joe could barely keep up. A few minutes later, the dog skidded to a stop near an old, abandoned shed. The wooden structure sagged under. Years of neglect, its walls covered in graffiti, its windows shattered. The dog whined, scratching at the rotting door. Joe hesitated. He had no idea what was waiting inside. But the dog had led him this far. It wasn't done yet. Holding the girl protectively, he braced himself and kicked the door open. The stench hit him first. Rot, decay. A foul mixture of something old and something worse. And then, in the dim light, from his phone's flashlight, he saw them. 2 more children, a boy and a girl barely older than the child in his arms, huddled together on the floor. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow with fear. They flinched as the door burst open, their small bodies tensing, like they expected another monster to step inside. Joe's chest tightened. Who had done this? Why were these kids here? The stray dog padded inside carefully, its tail low, ears twitching as it approached the children. It gave a soft whimper and licked the boy's hand. The boy barely reacted, too weak to move. Joe swallowed hard. He couldn't afford to think about the why right now. He had to act. Hey, it's okay, Joe said gently, lowering himself to their level. I'm here to help. I'm getting you out of here. The girl blinked at him, confusion and fear swirling in her sunken eyes. The boy tried to speak but only managed a croaky whisper. Joe pulled out his phone with one hand, dialing 911 with trembling fingers. I need immediate assistance, he said, voice urgent. 3 kids abandoned. They're in bad shape. Send an ambulance now. The dispatcher fired off questions, but Joe's focus was split. The dog had backed away from the children and was now staring at something deeper in the shed. Joe followed its gaze, and his stomach dropped. In the far corner, half hidden under a filthy tarp, was a rusted metal cage. His blood turned to ice. This wasn't just kids getting lost. This was something much, much darker. Joe's breathing turned shallow as he stared at the cage in the corner of the shed. Rust coated the bars, but the metal was still strong, too strong for a child to escape from. His pulse thundered in his ears. Who the hell would put kids in here? The stray dog stood motionless, ears perked, eyes locked on the cage as if it expected something or someone to emerge. A deep, guttural growl rumbled in its throat. Joe swallowed hard. His gut told him they weren't alone. He slowly backed toward the children, keeping his eyes on the shadows lurking beyond the broken walls. The little girl in his arms whimpered, her tiny fingers clutching his jacket. Then, a sound. A rustling outside. Footsteps. Joe tensed. His mind screamed run, but his body refused to move. The stray's growl deepened, its fur bristling, and then a voice. You weren't supposed to find them. Joe spun around. A man stood in the doorway. His silhouette was sharp against the faint glow of distant streetlights, but Joe could make out the broad shoulders, the heavy boots, the slow, deliberate way he stepped forward. There was no panic, only control. The dog let out a vicious snarl, stepping in front of Joe. It was ready to fight. Joe's instincts roared to life. This man, whoever he was responsible for the cage. He didn't know how deep this went, but one thing was clear. This wasn't random. You need to leave, Joe said, his voice low and steady. The man chuckled, cold, amused. And if I don't? Joe clenched his jaw. He could fight, but with 3 injured kids? He needed a different plan. His phone was still in his hand, the 911 call still open. He slowly raised it, making sure the screen's faint glow was visible. They already know where I am. The man stiffened, a flicker of hesitation. Then, Dog lunged. A blur of teeth and fury, it launched itself at the man with terrifying speed. The snarl that ripped from its throat was unlike anything Joe had ever heard. The man stumbled back, cursing, trying to shake the dog off as it clamped. Its jaws around his arm. "Go!" Joe roared. He didn't wait for another second. He scooped up the remaining kids, shoving past the man and bolting out of the shed. The dog stayed behind, still fighting. Joe ran, his muscles burning, his mind screaming at him to move faster. Behind him, the man let out a furious, pain-laced howl. Then, the wail of sirens. Blue and red lights cut through the darkness. Joe gasped in relief. The police had arrived. He collapsed to his knees, holding the kids close as officers swarmed the area. His body trembled from adrenaline, from fear, from the weight of what had just happened, and then the dog appeared, blood on its muzzle, fur matted, panting heavily, but alive. Joe met its eyes. A silent understanding passed between them. This dog, this stray, hadn't just saved those kids. It had saved him too. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street in sharp contrasts as paramedics rushed to the children. Joe sat on the cold pavement, his heart still pounding, his arms aching from carrying them. The reality of what had just happened hit him like a tidal wave. The little girl, the first one he had found, was awake now, clinging to his shirt, her frail body trembling. One of the paramedics gently pried her away, wrapping a warm blanket around her small shoulders. "They're dehydrated, malnourished," the medic said, "but they'll make it." Joe let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The stray dog stood beside him, panting, its tail wagging slightly. It didn't look like a hero, but that's exactly what it was. An officer approached, notebook in hand. "Mr. Rogan, you just saved these kids from something unthinkable. Do you have any idea what you just uncovered?" Joe swallowed, shaking his head. "I don't know who that guy was, but he was keeping them in a cage. If it weren't for this dog—" He gestured to the scruffy mutt beside him. "None of this would have been found in time." The officer glanced at the dog, then back at Joe. "That's no ordinary stray." Joe looked down at the dog, now resting its head on his knee. He reached out, running a hand through its scruffy fur. It had led him here. It had fought for them. It had risked everything. Joe wasn't the sentimental type, but something about this dog, its fierce determination, its undeniable instinct to save, stirred something deep inside him. The officer crouched down, rubbing the dog's head. "You got a name, buddy?" The dog wagged its tail. Joe exhaled, a small smile breaking through the chaos. "I guess we should give him one." He thought for a second, then smirked. "How about Guardian?" The officer nodded. "Fitting." As the paramedics loaded the children into the ambulance, Joe knew one thing for sure. He wasn't leaving. Without this dog. Days passed, but the events of that night never left Joe's mind. The kids were safe. The man responsible had been arrested. Investigators uncovered a horrifying network of child trafficking, and thanks to that stray dog, Guardian, they had stopped something truly monstrous. Joe sat on his back porch sipping coffee, the early morning sun casting golden light over his yard. At his feet, Guardian lay curled up, finally at peace. No longer a stray, no longer alone. The story had spread like wildfire. News headlines called it a miracle. Hero dog saves. Abducted children. People were calling Guardian a modern-day lassie, a true protector. But Joe didn't care about the attention. All he cared about was the unbreakable bond he had formed with the dog that had stopped his car that night. He reached down, scratching behind Guardian's ears. The dog sighed contentedly, nuzzling into Joe's palm. "Yeah, buddy," Joe murmured, a small smile tugging at his lips. "I think we both found what we were looking for." And for the first time in a long while, Joe felt whole, because sometimes the ones who save us aren't human at all.